to this session on qualitative research and doing qualitative analysis with Quircos, which is a piece of software which tries to make doing qualitative analysis easy. What we're doing today is a little bit different. We're going to do a very brief overview of qualitative research, some of the different methods and approaches that you can use. And then we're going to do the first of a two-part session about how to analyze the data using Quircos as an example. But you could use any piece of software or any other technique. There'll also be a link to the workshop materials that we're going to use in this session. And you can download those and use in your own time with any piece of software and get a practice on doing some qualitative analysis before you come to do your own data. Now, whatever kind of stage you're at in your own research, it's quite useful to understand the analysis process first. It demystifies it a little bit, and it also helps you when you're going through and collecting the data and deciding on the questions, what kind of approach will fit and the kinds of things that you can be looking for through the whole thing. So, very brief presentation to start with. My take on qualitative research is that everyone is a qualitative researcher in some way. We always hear these statistics about people being very confident about working with numbers, but we're very confident working with text as well. And qualitative research is usually stories, text, pictures, interactions, kind of things that we deal with every day. And in fact, there's this quote that I love from an American study which found that the average person in the States is exposed to more than 100,000 words a day in terms of what's on TV, what's in the newspaper, what people say around them. It's a fantastic amount of data, people telling you things, trying to explain things to you, and the way in which we understand our world. And that's really what qualitative research is about, using those stories and descriptions of other people talking about their world to better understand processes in society or market research or whatever we're looking into. And one of the things that I like to say about qualitative researchers is that they are always in the field. This is a quote that comes from a paper by Katz, and she says that qualitative researchers are always working in a sense. They're always looking at the world, analyzing it, and trying to understand what makes it tick. And in essence, that's what we're doing, pulling apart these kind of very complicated connections, like a kind of neural net of interactions that go on in people's lives that make up the world. And when we want to do that, we've got some kind of question, some kind of problem that we want to better understand. So what is qualitative research in this context? Well, everybody's got a different interpretation, so I'm just going to give you my own and a very kind of top-level kind of overview of some of the things that make up qualitative research. But for me, the most important thing is it's about understanding not just what happens, but why. A lot of the time we see statistics that tell you that there's a certain problem, for example, maybe with obesity or heart disease or something like that, but they don't tell you the cause of the problem or why that problem got to that certain way. Often qualitative research is used to drill down and get that in-depth understanding behind the statistics of why certain things are happening in that way. And when we've got that understanding of why things are in a particular way, then we can attempt to solve them. Most qualitative research is focused around collecting and reviewing stories. So it's talking to people, getting them to tell you their own story, their own narrative, and then comparing that with what other people are saying and trying to find some kind of patterns and coming to a kind of conclusion. The real difference here is that we're looking at these narratives. So a story is one individual interpretation, and a narrative is something where it's integrated with a lot of other people's stories. And that's really what you're looking at, narratives in anything that you're doing in qualitative research. Not the numbers behind it. It doesn't matter how many people you talk to, how many people from a different demographic. As long as you're aware of who you've sampled for that research, it's not about more is better. It's actually about the depth of understanding is really what you're looking for most of the time in qualitative research. So what are some of the methods that we can use in that qualitative approach? Well, there are literally dozens. the most common ones that you'll find are the story collection ones, the standard story collection ones. So that's interviews, focus groups, and participant observation. So in interviews, you'll talk to someone one-on-one, and you'll generally ask them very open-ended questions. And you're trying to not get them to give you a yes or no answer, but to actually describe something. Like you might say, well, why do you like this particular brand of cat food? And then when you're doing focus groups, you're doing a kind of group discussion around that. So you might have many different people talking about different kinds of cat food, how their cat likes it, or how cheap it is, or how it smells, and things like that. And then there's participant observation. So that would be actually going into people's homes and watching them feed their cats. They've said something about what kind of cat food they use and how often they feed their cat. And is that actually true? If you go and watch people during the day, are they actually very busy sometimes and not feeding their cat at the same time, or very stressed so they can't get their favorite brand of cat food? They don't have time to go to the supermarket and just get whatever they can from the corner store. So that's the kind of depth that these different approaches can give you. And these are a very kind of traditional trio used in a lot of market research, but also a lot of social research to try and find out why people act and behave in particular ways. The other ways in which are very commonly used is especially surveys, where you ask people to describe and write their story for you. And you may ask them very guided questions for particular things that you're interested to understand about how they're interpreting the world. But the other one that I've got up there is one that I'm particularly fond of, and there's a great new paper actually up there about that, which I'll put up on our Twitter feed, which is on participant diaries. And this is where you actually get people to write their story for you as they do it. So it's like writing a diary. So it's like a Jane Austen novel or something like that, but they're writing actually for you rather than themselves. And at the end of the period of time, they give you back their diaries, and you look to see how they described what they were doing, what problems they were having, and all those kind of things. And that's actually a very useful way to do participant observation in a certain extent, but over a much longer period, because it's a lot less time consuming. People are living their lives anyway. You don't have to watch them every day. So it's a method I particularly like. There's also document or policy analysis. In social research, this is a very big deal as well, because you'll be often looking at, if you might be researching an organization, for example, a hospital, and you might want to look at their records, their internal communications, you might want to look at their policy, and that will be very revealing about how things work in that organization and what they do. And policy analysis, well, that can be internal policy for an organization, but it can also be political analysis. So looking at political bills or discussion when political bills are being made, to try and see what the terminology is there. What does that show? And even sometimes looking longitudinally, saying, well, how is this policy changing over time? Now, that's something which can be integrated very well with any of the other surveys. So, for example, if you're doing something about, as we talked about before, about obesity or something like that, then we might also want to look and see what policy had done about promoting healthy eating options in the country, and whether that was actually having an effect on the behavior that you see in people every day. And then the final one we've got here is the kind of the wild card one to a certain extent. There's a lot of people who do qualitative methods involving geography, especially in terms of people walking, going through landscapes, using maps to talk about how they interact with their environment. Video, either getting people to video lives or a particular, for example, shopping experience themselves, or using video to watch people, is a very time-consuming but very revealing way to capture qualitative data. You can also get people to do things like pictures, so take pictures in their day-to-day life of things that they're having problems with or things that they're interested in. And also there's art and creative methods. So I've seen people who've used very effectively even things like getting people to do drawings, or even clay modeling about how they feel about stressful events and things like that. And that kind of actually becomes one of the methods, not just to promote discussion, which is one of the things you're looking for, but the art itself and these various different creative methods that you can have actually form part of the data itself. So the question is, if you've used one or probably many of these different methods, how on earth can you pull all these things together? How can you find an answer to your research question that draws from all of these different methods? If you've got people who've made a clay statue and you've interviewed them and that's a text, and you've also got video as well, what can you do with that? Well, the important thing about analyzing qualitative data, I think, is to try and bring that all together. And the most important thing to really realize if you're starting out in qualitative research is that it's very time consuming to do the analysis. If you've done statistical analysis before, one of the great appeals is you get the answer very quickly. You put the numbers in, you run a particular, for example, significance test or whatever you're looking at, and you get an answer very quickly. When you're working with qualitative data, you really need to interrogate that data. You need to get to know it very, very personally, and in a very great level of depth, sometimes by reading or watching or interacting with that data over and over again for days, weeks, months, or even years sometimes. And then the process of doing that analysis in terms of answering that research question and then obviously communicating that with others involves you summarizing all of that data from all of those different sources and then drawing connections from what you've seen there. So you want to find some kinds of patterns or some bits of data which connect with your research question. There are a bunch of different approaches which people use when coming to the data analysis. I'm just going to go through some of these now to give you a kind of idea of what's out there. It's best that you look for yourself, find some papers, find some textbooks. There's excellent textbooks out there that deal with these in much more depth and decide which is going to be right for you. And the first one up here is thematic or content analysis. And that's really something which is probably the default setting. So that's looking to see, as thematic suggests, the themes which are in the data. So particular topics which are coming out, which are interesting to you. And that usually comes down to creating codes or nodes, they're sometimes called. They're called quirks in Quircos, but the individual topics of interest in your project. And what you're looking for is basically to categorize a part of your data as being about one of those, whether it's a section of video, a section of audio, a particular piece of art, or more likely a section of text. Now, the next one is discourse analysis. Now, here you'll be able to see that there's various different ways that you can start looking at this data and interrogating this data. With discourse analysis, you're looking for something slightly different, not just the themes, not just exactly what people are saying, but actually what's the wider status around that. So if people are talking about obesity, for example, as we talked about before, how does that fit in with a wider discourse? How does that affect how society views obesity, and how is that affecting how people describe their own stories? So that's a kind of the kind of approach that you might do with discourse analysis. Now, another one is narrative analysis. This sometimes also is called phenomenology, and this is looking to see how people describe their story. What's the process of the story? What leads to what the phenomenons are. And you can also not only just look at time, but you can look at the different metaphors that people use, for example. And you also might look to see what particular language people are using. So if people have a particularly negative language when they talk about obesity, that might imply something about how it's interpreted in society or how that particular person views obesity. So looking at the narrative is very important. Sometimes these terms have various different terms coming from different places. Another one is semiotic analysis. Now, this is actually to look to see slightly more psychological level, I suppose, how people understand their own world. And by looking at their language, what does that imply about how they understand and perceive their actions in that world? So that's just four kind of approaches that you might take. Now, those seem very theoretical. They are very theoretical approaches. So the next question is probably, well, how do you get down to the guts of it all? How do you actually do that analysis in a physical way? Well, there are, again, a variety of different approaches that you might take. And as ever, the standard caveat, these are going to be, you're going to have to decide which one to use based on what your research question is and what methods you've chosen. Now, the two overarching theories here are, especially when you're doing the sort of thematic content analysis we talked about. First of all, there's the grounded theory. That's where it's sometimes also called emergent or inductive coding. That's basically letting the data describe the topics for you. So you start with a blank sheet, you look through the sources, and you'll say, as it comes up, okay, this person is talking about sugary food. This person is talking about exercise. This person is talking about depression. And you'll have a series of different categories. You'll probably go through several times to do low-level coding. So those might be the things like sugary foods or exercise, and the higher level things like a societal discourse or negative attitudes or something that's more complicated. And then the other approach is framework analysis. And this is much more structured and is driven by pre-existing theory. This is where you've got a much better idea before you start about what you're interested in and how those particular themes are going to help you meet your research question. And what happens here is you actually set up your framework, the structure, the list of codes, which might be grouped together before you start the project, because you've done some reading about particular theories which describe these different themes, or you've got some good idea from a pre-existing piece of research about what the important issues are going to be. And so rather than doing this as you go along, you've got a set framework in advance that's going to answer your research question, and you basically use that to interrogate your data and pull out and describe what bits of your data fit in each of those parts of the framework. So those are the two very broad categories. Now, there's a lot of nuance between those, a lot of discussion about different approaches to do this, and a lot of people do something that ends up being a little bit in the middle. So don't feel that you have to go just one or another. Again, there are lots more examples for reading. I'll put some links down below. So find out more and find out which is going to fit with you best. Now, what we're going to do is help you actually go through and do some coding using Quircos, which is our software package for doing qualitative analysis with text data. Now, if you want to be working with audio or video, that's not something that we support at the moment. You might want to go and look at some of the other packages. Again, there's some links down below which will give you more information about those. So what we're going to do here is take you through starting your first project and describing yourself as one of the authors in the project, show you how to bring some text into the project. Then we're going to look at how we describe those sources of text that we just brought in. We're going to create some themes, also sometimes called nodes, and we're going to group those and rearrange those and make our framework essentially. And then I'm going to show you the very basic parts of doing code and retrieve operations. That's adding a piece of text to one of those nodes and then being able to see everything that you've got coded under one of those nodes. That's as much as we're going to cover this week. Next time, we're going to go through and do some more of the more complicated actions. We're going to look through the alternate views. So these are different ways to look at the data, to rearrange the framework and the nodes. We're going to look at grouping those nodes by levels, as well as doing categorized descriptions of them. We're going to do queries on that data, so interrogate and explore that data using particular parameters. We're going to generate some reports to share some of those findings, and then cover some of the other ways of exporting data, including to other spreadsheet software, statistical software, and also even back to Word with sort of colored highlights and things like that. Then we're going to look at very quickly at structured questions and how you do a survey or an online survey, and finally just some tips and tricks. But that's all coming next week. So for now, let's get started and let's try a little bit of qualitative analysis. So I'm just going to tab now here through to Quircos. So this is the first view you get in Quircos, which shows you all of the files that you've opened before. What we're going to do here is create a new project, which is going to contain our data. And for this example, we're going to use some example data, which comes from a research project that we did on the Scottish independence referendum, which happened a couple of years ago. It's quite a topical thing for us locally, so we did some research on that. And we've got all of those data and materials available on the website. So you can imagine it's your own research project, your first qualitative research project. You've got your data. Now what you can do to analyze it. So all that data is there for you to play with, to make mistakes with. And then that's a way that you can kind of learn the process before you get going on your own data, if that works for you. So I'm just going to click on the new project button, which is on the bottom right. Now, the first thing that this does is ask us to put in an author name. I'm going to keep that Daniel. Now, this is useful, especially if you're doing work as part of a team, or maybe your supervisors are looking in and doing some stuff as well. Because then all the changes are marked with your name and you can see everything that was done by a particular person and what date. So that's quite useful. There's an option here to password protect the file. All you have to do there is put your password in twice to make sure that you don't mistype it. And that means that someone won't be able to open the project in Quircos without knowing the password. And that's useful if you're working with confidential data. You've got data protection requirements that mean you need to keep that data encrypted and secure. So I'll turn that off for now. And then there's this option here for structured questions. Now that's if we're doing a survey, but the project we're working with actually is based off face-to-face interviews, which we've transcribed. So they're open-ended questions. They don't ask the same question to every person. So we can actually turn those off. And we'll just go with the standard open-ended project. So we'll click on New Project. It'll ask us where we want to save it. I've got a folder on the desktop here for the referendum project. And I'm going to call this Week 1 example, I think. There we go. So I'll just click Save. And there we've got our new project. And as you can see, it's completely blank. So what we need to do here is actually bring in some sources of data. Now you'll see in the bottom right corner here, there's a plus button, and it also says click to add source. Now you can click anywhere there, click on the plus button, and it pops up and asks you how you want to bring in a source of text. Now you can bring in a whole folder of files at once if you want to. We're just going to bring in one for the moment. So we'll do it one by one just to show the process. So we'll choose import source, select a file, and then at the top right, there's the select file button. We'll click on that and it comes up with a standard dialog to open the file. If we go to the desktop and the referendum project, you'll see in here, we've got some Word documents here with different people in there. So we can choose any of these to basically jump in there and bring that source in. So let's pick the first one. Let's choose Adrian. So we'll double click on that. You get a little bit of a preview of the text here. And if we click on that, yeah, we can see a little more. So that looks right. That's the one we wanted to bring in. Now here we can change the source title at the top. So it's probably going to be useful if we change that to Adrian. Help us find that later. And then we'll click import. Now what you'll see on the right is that we've now brought in that source of text. And with this slider here, we can actually change the thickness of the column so we can see a little bit more of the text. Now we've got this whole source in here. It's quite long. I think it's about 5,000 words or something like that. Probably about typical for an hour's interview when it's been transcribed. You see this person is talking here about the Scottish referendum. The first question is, when was the first time you heard that there was going to be a referendum? But now already I can see that there's a typo here. Now we've got this sentence here. When was the first time you heard that the r? So there's a little space in here which shouldn't be there. But we can actually edit that text directly in here. So if we right click and choose edit source text, we can get rid of that little mistake there. Right away, that's where we go. So we've now got our source of text in there, and I'm just going to do that one more time. So we've got a couple of sources in here. At this stage, we could actually bring in all the sources of text using the entire folder button, but that's just going to take us a little bit ahead of ourselves for now. So we're just going to bring in just one more source for now, and we'll pick Julie, I think. You see, I think that's the first question being asked there as well. So we'll change that to Julie. Click on the import button, and there that one's been brought in. I think this is a slightly shorter source. But you can see that's the discussion there. There's the interviewer with the Q there and the answers from A. So now we've brought in those two sources of text. We've described their names, but we don't know anything else about them, and we haven't described those in the software at all. But once we've got lots of different sources in there, that will be pretty useful. So what we can actually do is if you click on this button at the top right, this is the grid view here, that toggles the source properties view. And what that will do is, it's blank at the moment, but by clicking on this little plus button here, quickly add a new property. We can add a property and a value, which we use to describe the source. So for example, property might be gender, and the value here might be female. So if we do that, we've now created a property for all of the sources in our project, which is gender, a way that we want to describe our sources, and one value for that gender, which is female. Now, if we click on the tab down here for Adrian, you can see now we're working with Adrian's source. We can see that the category of gender is there for Adrian, but there's no value defined for it yet. If we click on this downward arrow here, you will actually see a list of all the values which so far have been put into the project. And you can see there's female, but we need to describe Adrian as male. So we'll actually select new value here, and we'll choose male. We'll click OK there. And now Adrian has been described as male. Go back to Julie. Julie is female. Now that way in the future, we can do queries just for the men or the women in the project and actually compare them side by side. So we might want to see on a particular topic, what are the men saying and how does that compare to how the women are saying? Now, there may be various other ways that you want to describe. So for example, the location of where these people live, their age, their occupation, their favorite TV show, their political parties might be quite a useful one here. Anything that you might want to explore at some stage in the data. And you can add these at any time. So if we click on the properties and values editor here, this gives us a lot more control over the properties and values and allows us to remove particular ones or change them if we wanted to put man or woman or something like that. But we can also create a new property and value in here. And let's create one which is going to be multiple choice. So for example, if we put in here favorite TV show, and then we can put a value in here like the news maybe. So maybe this person told you or in a survey that the news was their favorite thing. So let's add another value here, which might be, what could we say? X factor. Okay. So maybe that's another property as well. But with this little button here, we can make that a multiple choice category. Now, what that means is someone can actually have more than one favorite TV show, so they can be a fan of the news and they can also watch X Factor every time that's on. So now if we close this, we can see we're working with Adrian's source here, that there's a little infinity symbol here, which shows that this is a multiple choice category. And if we click on favorite TV show and the downward arrow here, we'll see we've got those two values, news and X Factor. So now somebody can be a fan of the news and X Factor. And you can remove any of these at any stage just by clicking on the cross there. Now, if we go to Julie, we can describe her as being a fan of X Factor and news, just like that, very quickly. Now, you can get a quick overview of what your data source looks like with this button at the top right. That's the properties overview. And clicking on that will show you a graph. So that shows here that 50% of our respondents are male, 50% are female. And with the favorite TV show, so the news is much more popular so far than X Factor. That's how it's filling out. The graph slightly distorted here because, of course, we've allowed multiple choices, so people can have more than one response, but there's no maximum limit. So we'll click on the cross there, and we're done with our properties and have come back to the text view. So that's the sources and the source properties. Next, we're going to look at creating and arranging the codes and the nodes. So the first one that we'll probably put here, I think, is this first question, which has been asked. When did you first hear that there was going to be a referendum about independence? So we want to create a code where we can keep together every time somebody talked about the first time they heard about the referendum. So if we click on the plus button here, that will create in a random place somewhere on the canvas a bubble, and that bubble will represent whatever topic we're interested in. And that is first heard of referendum. Now you can actually put a longer description here. Our title's already quite long, but you can put a longer description there if you need to change that. You can change the color here. So I'm not sure what appropriate color would be for that, but we'll change that to a purple. There's lots of choice here. And you can obviously group those, have a color code which puts together particular themes which have commonality. Here are the levels. There's no levels in here at the moment. We're going to come back and look at that next time. So we'll click on save. And now I've got this little bubble here, first heard of the referendum. And by clicking and dragging on it, we can actually move it anywhere in this gray area which appears here. Now, when we've done that, what we actually want to do is create another category, which is a bit more general, which is just about the referendum. So if we click on the plus button again, we get another one. Oh, it's come up as purple, but we'll call it referendum. Let's make that maybe a different shade of purple, I think. Darker. Looks good. Okay, so we've now got two sources there. And it may be that you want to start grouping and categorizing your themes. So for example, the referendum may actually be a kind of general topic, and first heard of the referendum may be something which is a subcategory of that. And if we wanted to do that, all we have to do is click and drag and drop that bubble onto the parent. Now you'll see that that gets a white halo around it. That indicates that there are subcategories underneath it. And this pink first heard of referendum is now subcategory. And if we move those around, they move in that fashion. So I'm just going to create one more here, which is going to be about something completely different, about the media. And you can actually right click anywhere on the canvas and add a quirk. So let's create a green one here and call this media, because I can actually see reading ahead a little bit. Somebody starts talking about representation of the referendum in the media. So now we've got a series of codes. Now, depending whether we were doing grounded theory or we were doing framework analysis, we would either keep adding to this as we went along, or we would set up our framework first, probably even before we brought in the sources. But for now, let me just quickly show you the basics about how you can add some text to these codes, so actually to start doing the analysis. So if we wanted to add this section of text here to be first heard of referendum, for example, all we do is click and drag to select, just in the same way you would in word processing software or any other piece of software. Click anywhere within the highlighted piece of text, hold down the mouse button and drag it onto the bubble. Drop it straight on there. Now you see that that bubble instantly got a lot bigger. Now in Quircos, these bubbles grow as you add text to them, and that gives you some kind of idea about what you're coding most, possibly even what interesting findings are coming up. And it also gives you a sense of visual feedback that yes, you added that to the right bubble. And you'll also see two other things have happened here. The text has been highlighted in that color. That's this text is only about this particular topic. And there's a little stripe here as well. And that allows us to see lots of different things. So we may say that this text is also about the referendum. It's a little bit redundant, but for now we'll add that to be the referendum topic as well. Now they're the same size, they have the same amount of data on them, and you'll see there's two stripes here side by side. And in this bottom left corner here, if you hover the mouse over, you'll see what the topic is. So this is about referendum and when we first heard of the referendum. So that's how we add text to these nodes. And what we can do now is to double click on any of these bubbles. So let's take referendum, and that will show us all the text which has been coded. And you'll see this has just come up here twice because we've actually added it twice. It's in referendum and it's in first heard of referendum. And this view on the left here shows us the hierarchy for this code. So we can have subcategories here. We can also have subcategories. So this will provide you a kind of tree-like graph of what the relationship is between the different categories you've got here. So on the left, we've got that view, and on the right, by clicking on one of these codes, we can see everything which has been coded behind them. So let's click on the home button at the top left. Whatever view you're in, that will always take you back to this main view. So that's always useful to know. Now let's add something quickly to media. Right, that must have been because it was in the media. And you can see, so this is the basic operation. And what you would now do is probably spend weeks of your life going through all of your data, tagging and adding it to different codes. At some stage, you'll probably decide that you don't like the referendum code, or you don't like the first heard of referendum. You may do things like merging so that you can merge these two together. So we can merge that with referendum and create a merged category there. At any time, you can always undo anything in Quircos. So you can also change your mind and unchange your mind, as long as it's something you've done within the scope of the last time you've worked on the project. You'll notice also that there's no save button here. Now that's actually because Quircos saves everything as you go along, every time you make an action. So even if you pulled the plug from your computer, you would still have your data just how you last worked on it, just the very last thing that you did. So there's actually no need to save the data before you close the software, and no save button. But here with the project button, you can actually save it as a new file if you want to do that. So that way you can kind of have a snapshot of your project at a particular stage in the coding process. So that's actually all we're going to cover for this session. This has just been about 40 minutes, just to give you the very basics of doing coding and analysis. Obviously, you go through, you do a lot more codes, you do a lot more coding and adding. And what we're going to do next week is actually kind of take off from a stage where we've assumed that we've done some coding. We're going to use an example file, which is together with all the materials for the workshop. And that will show you how it looks like when someone's gone through and coded the data. And then next time, we're going to actually go through and show you how you can explore the data using Quircos, visualize some of the findings, look at connections between the different data points, and then export that so you can share the findings with other people and put it in your PhD thesis or journal articles or whatever documents you need to be working with.